I think if you were to speculate, you would say that a lot of leaders of the Catholic Church would like a modest course correction from where Francis went. And you wouldn't expect cardinals to say, we want the traditionalist, we want Benedict XVI, but more so, you'd expect them to want someone who could sort of not rock the boat too much and hold things together. America has gone through a 20-year period of secularization. Institutional religion in the U.S. has never been weaker. Church attendance has declined. More Americans than ever before say they have no religious affiliation. But we've also entered in the last few years into a kind of pause in that trajectory. Really, the best way to think about it is that America isn't having a religious revival. It's sort of considering whether to have one. That's the phrase I've been using.
Ross, thank you for joining us. We want to talk to you today about the Catholic Church and, of course, your book. And we're speaking to you in the wake of the death of Pope Francis and as the conclave begins. And I'm wondering if you could just start by giving us a sort of picture. This is a big topic for you to start with, a picture of faith today in America.
Sure. I think the best way to think about the religious landscape right now is that America has gone through a 20-year period of secularization. You have a large number of people, really the first big generation in our history that's been raised without even a sort of Christmas and Easter or Sunday school kind of exposure to religious faith. But in an interesting way, that's making some of them more open to religion and religious questions than their parents or grandparents would have been, because they don't have this sort of memory of a kind of oppressive seeming institutional framework. But that impulse can go in all kinds of directions. So you could easily imagine some sort of explicit revival where more people go to church, more people belong to Christian denominations, but it could also just be a kind of more purely individualistic thing where you have lots more interest in, spiritualism, the occult, UFOs, a very kind of 1970s sort of landscape. So I think both of those scenarios are there on the table, but we don't know fully what direction the culture is going.
I never met Pope Francis. I don't know if you have done, but I mean, his whole ethos was a church that was more inclusive, less hierarchical, as a Jesuit, protected the poor and the masses. Uh, when you look at his role in the Catholic Church over the last few years and who he brought into or did not bring into the Catholic Church, how would you quantify his papacy?
I mean, it's hard to quantify a papacy, but I think that's right, that the Pope was skeptical or hostile to some of the forms of conservative and even traditionalist Catholicism that have often been unexpectedly successful in sort of winning over sort of college graduates, more elite Westerners, and saw Catholicism as, ideally as a faith more for the masses, but saw that happening primarily, I think, through a kind of liberalization and a certain kind of accommodation with modern culture. But in a way, the story I would tell is that what Francis wanted the church to be more competitive with those non-denominational evangelical kind of churches. But the particular form of more liberal Catholicism that he didn't fully embody, but at least partially embodied, is actually less appealing, seemingly. And it sort of loses people at both ends. It loses people both to, non-denominational churches and to more conservative forms of faith. So I think he was a tremendously charismatic and influential figure as an embodiment of the church on the global stage. But I think the particular model of Roman Catholicism that he embraced is actually likely to decline further in the future. And if you're looking for, what are the forms of faith adapted to the 21st century, you are looking at either more conservative forms of Catholicism or more non-denominational, enthusiastic forms of Christianity than what sort of, frankly, older older liberal Catholic bishops and cardinals are comfortable with.
Okay, so that brings us very neatly to the conclave, which is just starting, the kind of what has become the greatest political religious show on earth, I guess. Thank you to Robert Harris and his very successful movie with Ray Fiennes. Um,
Well, he was building on material, that the
it
church
was
had already supplied. Let's give Catholicism its due.
the shtick about American politics is that it's a pendulum, or at least that's been the shtick to date. That it swings one way and then it swings the other way. I don't know if this is even in a kind of interesting or appropriate analogy, but you've hinted at some of that
Yes.
in your last answer, that you think that Pope Francis is that the Catholic Church may now be at some sort of a juncture. It's clearly at some sort of juncture. It has to choose its new leader. And where does it go? Does it carry on the tradition of Pope Francis, or are we going to see a shift to to something more conservative, more dogmatic?
Right. So to the extent that you can handicap a papal election, and to be clear, I believe you can be excommunicated for betting on one. So
Okay,
you need to. I
I'll
need.
keep it. It's a
I
secret between you and me. Then,
need to
okay.
tread care. Right. No one will see this. Right. Um, I I think if you were to speculate, you would say that a lot of leaders of the Catholic Church, um, would like a modest course correction from where Francis went. They would think to themselves, okay, we don't want a hard swing towards any kind of traditionalism, but we think Francis sort of went too far in fact, some of his wars on traditionalists, his attempt to ban the traditional Latin Mass, and also in his enthusiasm for sort of constantly opening up fraught subjects for debate. So I think rather than a pendulum swing, I think a lot of cardinals would be looking for some kind of figure who was seen as a moderate, who could sort of hold the church together. Because one thing Francis did was sort of make the liberal factions in the church demand more and the conservative factions rebel. So the difference, but the gulf between, say, the liberal Catholic Church in Germany and the more conservative churches in sub-Saharan Africa, that gap is pretty wide right now. So again, you wouldn't expect cardinals
Mm.
to say we want the traditionalists, we want Benedict the 16th, but more so, you'd expect them to want someone who could sort of not rock the boat too much and hold things together. However, the other reality is that Pope Francis picked cardinals from all over the world in ways that didn't follow at all the normal pattern of picking cardinals. Instead of picking cardinals from the big cities, the big archbishops and so on, he picked people who just sort of struck him in different ways. And it isn't always clear that they had any kind of theological or ideological consistency. So you have all these cardinals coming in, many of whom have never met one another. He didn't hold a lot of meetings of cardinals. And I think that means that saying, "Oh, the Cardinals want a moderate," maybe that works as a generalization, but it doesn't actually tell you a lot about how these men are going to think and vote and operate once they're thrown together for the first time. So that places a limit on all handicapping. You know, what people might say they want in theory could end up yielding something very different when they actually come together and vote.
Okay, I absolutely don't want to be responsible for your excommunication, so we'll leave the
Well,
handicapping at
I didn't lay
that's
odds.
just
I
you
didn't lay
didn't lay
odds,
odds.
so I'm in good shape.
Ross, your book, Believe Why Everyone Should Be Religious. Why did you write this book now? We live in a world where there is an awful lot of chaos and lack of belief in institutions, and people feel confused by technological, political, climate changes that are happening around us. Did you feel that was a backdrop against which your argument might fall on friendly ears?
To some degree, yes. I think that there's a reason that writers like Dawkins and the other new atheists found a friendly audience 20 years ago. I think it had to do with the aftermath of September 11th, a fear of religious fanaticism, opposition to George W. Bush, and sort of evangelical politics. I think they picked a good opening, or a good moment. And I think this is a moment 20 years on where people are less confident that a world without religion is going in a positive direction. I do think there is a certain amount of evidence that actual religious practice does have an effect on the individual, right? You can see this in studies of, especially studies related to the Mormon church and other places where you have sort of really strong communitarian religious cultures, and it does seem to have a real effect, even for people on the margins, in terms of their behavior, whether they get addicted to drugs, these kind of things. But what is definitely true is that you're never going to sustain a religious culture just on the promise that it's good for you to go to church. And this is, one of the points and arguments that I make in the book is that in the end, if you're going to get a religious revival, people have to be convinced that it's not just good for you, but that it's actually true and real, right? That in fact, you have to be persuaded that God is real and wants you to go to church, not just it's going to help, increase your social capital and psychological well being by 3.7%. We're very comfortable, especially journalists in sort of secular spaces, talking about how religion is good for you because it's something that, the secular person can sort of concede and
And there's
understand. And it's like,
data.
it's
As we
data.
like,
You can
we
measure
like
it.
data points.
And in America, everything we
Yes.
quote Alexis de Tocqueville at the drop of a hat. We're
Excellent.
like Tocqueville said, religion was good for you. But in the end, that is too limited a case, and I think it is
Mm.
important for religious arguers, myself obviously included, to sort of go a bit further and say, and also, there's almost certainly a God, and there's probably going to meet him when you die, and you should take that into account for your Sunday morning choices or Saturday choices as well. The other thing I'd say, though, is that I do think that a lot of people who are agnostic or who are interested in religion but think it's sort of anti-science or unreasonable and so on have not fully kept up with some of the stranger directions that our understanding of the laws of the universe, the sort of peculiar fine-tuning of the universe to allow for human life, the debates about the nature of consciousness. A lot of people haven't necessarily kept up with where those have gone. And I think some of those debates have gone in a direction that's quite friendly to religious ideas. And so it's worth sort of explaining that and arguing that at this moment, saying that actually, the militant atheist is not quite the representative of scientific certainty that maybe people assume that he is.
You advocate for organized religious faith, not kind of, as you vaguely referenced, California sort of, style mysticism. Not to disparage California, of course, our friends there
I
might well
was
be
I was
religious
born in San
too.
Francisco, so
There you
I
go.
can't
Um,
speak ill.
is it a curious position for somebody who is a practicing Catholic to find themselves in, to be advocating for other religious faiths that with which you may have some things in common, but a lot not in common?
Yes, I mean, I think there's obviously a kind of delicacy to the argument where I'm simultaneously saying, as a Catholic Christian, I think that my religion has the fullness of truth, and in an ideal world, I would persuade you of that. Um, but also recognizing that, the realities of pluralism, the, complexities and difficulties of any human life, the fact that there are long-standing religious debates that no single author or arguer is going to settle. All of that means that you need to be open to the idea that a movement towards religion is going to move some people into my own faith and some people into other faiths. And it's okay to argue for that, right? To sort of say, look, I want you to come all the way with me. But if you come part way and end up in a somewhat different place, that's still better than sitting forever in atheism or agnosticism. But I do sincerely think that in a pluralist society, everyone is not going to convert to the same religion. And it would be a good thing if more people moved into the terrain of serious religious practice.
Ross Douthat, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.